Good afternoon for those in Europe, and good morning or evening if you join us from other parts of the world. And welcome to this Fashion Transparency panel. Joining us today, we have Jenny Holloway, Chief Executive of Fashion Enter. We also have Dr. Mark Sumner, lecturer at the University of Leeds, and before that, Marks & Spencer sustainability expert. And I'm also delighted to welcome Elliot Barlow, who is working for the UKFT and is also head of production at Glover. Could we please start from a round of introductions, starting from Jenny?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me today. My role is CEO, and I'm founder of Fashion Enter. And we're an unusual company because we are not for profit, and we are our mission aim is to make sure that we're a centre of excellence. I've just got a few slides to explain who we are because we're quite an unusual company. As a social enterprise, we've got two aims. One is to be absolute centre of excellence for garment manufacturing, looking at all different types of artificial intelligence, etc. And also we want to be a centre of excellence for our training and development. There is a huge skills gap within garment manufacturing. We're making up to 40,000 garments a week. We've recently opened up a new factory in Newtown due to the sad demise of Laura Ashley. And we have about 200 staff now in total over 4 sites. We have 3 sites in London and 1 site in Newtown, which is Powys. One of the areas that has given us our edge on manufacturing and transparency is that we worked with a great guy called Mark Randall over a 4-year period, and we developed Galaxius. So Mark owns all the rights to Galaxius, but we perfected it, whereby you can see with the picture on the right-hand side, we know exactly who made what stitch on what garment at any one time. So we have excellent data on standard minutes. I have not come across any other system that is this transparent, and therefore it is ethical. We know exactly how many minutes any of our workers work. That relates to pay, and therefore we have a leading status in the fast forward audit that is highly recognised within the UK with retailers. The Fashion Technology Academy is very dear to our hearts, as we explained. We think there is a huge gap in skills, especially for garment manufacturing. I'm an ex-senior buyer from Arcadia, and I was also a selector at Marks & Spencer's. And those were the days when we had massive manufacturing suppliers, but just didn't realise how awesome they were until we haven't got them. And so our aim really is to put garment manufacturing back on the map within the UK, but also to have it highly regarded as it should be. The skills within garment manufacturing are pretty awesome. So what does sustainability mean to FEL? We do so much and we constantly want to keep on improving. We aim for zero waste, and we will give out any of our dead stock fabrics. So we're constantly giving to groups, parties, NGOs, etc. We've got very close rapport with the local colleges that we have. We've set up the fcfabricstudio.com, so we're selling our fabric at less than wholesale. We'd rather give it away. We've also got a label that we've created called thebeeoflondon.com. And that was to use our dead stock fabrics. But it's not enough to look at what garment manufacturing is today. It's about what the future is. And we are definitely moving away from bulk factory production. So it wasn't a long time ago that an average order that we would be making for our clients would be about 8,000 units. That's come down dramatically to 500 units and 800 units. And whilst any manufacturer will know that's not actually easy to coordinate with stop-start flow in production, it is the right thing ethically and also from a sustainable perspective. We can also see that we're moving to what we call the micro factory, and we are now converting one of our factories to become a micro factory. And that is with the introduction of vertically integrating backwards, using a cornet machine that will allow us to print our fabric in-house. And actually, the beauty of this machine is that you take a design, a daisy, and you put it into the pattern piece. And we are then going to automatically cut out the pattern pieces, and we will start making one garment at a time. And I think the aim eventually will be that customers will be able to input directly, place their order, and then we will also do a fulfillment service as well. Garment manufacturing is changing. We're also working along the Welsh Government at the moment, doing a feasibility study with the Potters Group. And we're looking at what can we do with wool and staple yarn, what can we do for upcycling. So this is a major programme that will take place within the next 2 weeks. So we're actually having a long-term perspective here on how can we use staple yarns. So very, very quick introduction. Certainly don't want to hog the time. So thank you for your time there.
Fantastic, Jenny. And Mark, could you give us a quick overview of what you have been involved into?
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you very much for having the opportunity to talk in today's session. Traceability, I have to confess, is something that I've been really interested in for many, many years. And I do tend to bore all of my students with talking about this constantly. And the reason I think that traceability is really important, and why having these conversations is really important, is down to 3 key things. When we do our research, and when we've been engaging with suppliers, and when I was working in the industry myself, it was absolutely clear that the sustainability of a product, its carbon footprint, its water footprint, all of those things are hard baked into that product in terms of where the materials come from and how that garment is made in the supply chain. Up to 80 to 90% of the footprint is associated with the supply chain. So if you want to know what your sustainability is in terms of your product, you have to know where that product's coming from, not just in terms of garment factories, but the fabric mills, the dye houses, spinning mills, and also where those raw materials are coming from. So that's a really big area for us in terms of sort of research, is understanding those sort of things. But layered on top of that, what we know is that for those brands, particularly within the COVID pandemic, those brands that had good traceability of their supply chains were able to manage and navigate the issues that were created around COVID, both for the benefit of their business, but also for the benefit of the workers in the supply chain. And we know that because we've just in the process of finishing a major project on exploring modern slavery and the impact of COVID on that for textile supply chains. And then the last bit, or the third component of why traceability is so important, is this idea of legal requirement. Modern slavery, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 requires you to understand who your suppliers are, because you will be responsible for whether there's modern slavery in your supply chain. And that's the first of a number of legal imperatives that will be coming down either from the UK government or from the EU or from other national states. So traceability is imperative for the industry, and particularly important for textiles, because we are such a global and diverse industry where we're sourcing from almost every country in the world in terms of finished product, fabrics, and raw materials. So I'm really looking forward to having a deeper discussion about this today.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Elliot, take the floor.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me also. My name's Elliot Barlow. I've worked in a variety of different garment production environments. This includes hands-on experience of managing clothing factories in London. I've established my own business as a garment manufacturing consultant. I've worked with multiple brands and designers, as well as in-house roles such as head of production, quality and technical within well-established high-end British brands. I've been involved in producing clothing at all levels of quality, volume and design philosophy. Currently, I'm working for the UKFT, which is the UK Fashion and Textiles Association. It's the largest network of fashion and textile companies in the UK. And we bring together designers, manufacturers, suppliers, agents and retailers and promote their businesses and our industry, both in the UK and throughout the world. So I'm really pleased to be part of this panel with you guys today. And that's enough from me. Thank you.
Excellent, Elliot. And thank you very much to all of you. I think you've touched on so many very interesting topics. I think it's my first question is going to tackle what I think is going on in most people's mind in the audience. It is widely acknowledged today that fashion supply chain need to evolve and become more sustainable and more transparent. And I was particularly interested by what Mark said earlier on, that there is a clear correlation between those brands that have been able to show transparency and actually coping well with COVID. So what is the view of the panel in terms of can traceable and sustainable supply chain be as profitable or as commercially viable? Mark, maybe if we can start from you, given that you brought up the sort of correlation, it'd be fantastic.
Roberto, I think it's a really, really good question. And I suspect that many people will be expecting us to say that it is difficult to be profitable while you're trying to invest in a traceability system. And having explored traceability and looking at practical solutions to traceability, yes, it is expensive. There is a cost involved in doing this. But if you ask the right questions, and if you use the data in the right way, not only can you actually offset the cost of having a traceable system, you can actually have very significant improvements within the efficiency of your supply chain. And that's not just about working your suppliers harder. It's about just being more effective and more efficient. I remember going to a dye house many years ago, and they were talking about the fantastic opportunities they had in terms of the different dye vessels they were using. And they had a dye vessel for dyeing a ton of yarn, but they didn't use it for my production. And I said, well, why is that? They said, well, we use this smaller vessel over here. And the reason we use that is because your orders come through in small quantities. But we could save a lot of money and improve quality by using this larger machine. And traceability, although that isn't the normal experience you would have in terms of traceability, having that visibility and understanding of how these different parts of the supply chain connect, having those conversations which would be driven by traceability, can actually mean that you end up with a much more effective supply chain, more efficient, more profitable, and in many cases, a faster responding supply chain. But it is based on this idea that you've got to ask the right questions and you've got to have the right traceability system in there. So I would definitely endorse and say, yes, traceability is about sustainability, but also it's about business. And what we've seen with the COVID pandemic is, as I say, when we've talked to businesses who understand who their suppliers are, not just in terms of the garment factories, but also the fabric mills, they've been able to work with them to understand issues around capacity and supply and manage that with the suppliers to the benefit of both parties. So there's some really interesting opportunities from a business perspective as well as that sustainability view.
I'd like to endorse what you said, actually, Mark, because I'm going to give you a real example of how we can illustrate that. So, contrary to what people may believe, a factory can only work at one quality level. So we have made Marks and Spencer's Best of British. We've made silk blouses for Ida, as well as making production for ASOS. I Saw It First. And all of our machinists are at one level. So it just because you have different brands, it doesn't mean that you have to compromise on quality. And when I was naive, when we first opened the factory, we had very good machinists, fast, medium, fast and slow. And what we did to differentiate and to appreciate our staff, we paid them at different rates. Just say for ease, we're talking £9, £10 and £11 an hour. So in my little head, I thought that, if you were slow, you're going to go faster, try and get to £2 extra an hour. That most categorically didn't work at all. So what we had to do was think of a new way of processing. And actually the traceability acted as performance-related pay. So now what we do, we work on standard minutes, and every single machinist is a unit in her own right. And we do work in batch production. And so the traceability actually acts as lean. So it actually makes us more efficient. And whilst there was mild hysteria when we first suggested to the staff we were going to go on performance-related pay, and it's the only time in my life where I have felt intimidated by my own staff because they were screaming banshees, it was actually the best thing to do. And in a 3-week period, everybody wanted to go on performance-related pay, and over a 3 month period, our productivity with the same staff went from 4,000 a week to 7,000 a week. And that was all because of traceability and accountability.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Really, really interesting to hear your field point of view, if you like. I move now to Elliot. Elliot, what can you tell us that will resonate with the audience?
I think, you know, we all understand that the supply chain itself, the fashion industry, is based on a supply and demand type of agreement. And I think if there's also demand for more sustainability and more transparency, then the system needs to accommodate that. I think that there's a few things that we have to understand about that from everyone's perspective, because we're all complicit within the supply chain. You know, the customer is sitting at one end and the manufacturers are sitting at the other, but the whole supply chain is part of that. And also the life cycle of the product after, post-consumer. So for a brand, really, it's going to be understanding, and this is to take Mark's point, that you have to understand the supply chain to its fullest. So from the procurement stage, and most businesses, if they're ordering materials from a Far Eastern supplier, they won't typically understand where their materials have come from. They'll understand that it's come from a factory or a mill, but beyond that is sort of unknown to them. When the goods have arrived and the product is then owned, where does it go after that? And how can traceability help that side of things? So I think, you know, a big notion that we all would need to understand is that, like a traffic jam, we're all part of that traffic. We're all a car in that, and we have to understand our place within that world and do our bit, what we can, to improve that.
Thank you very much, Elliot. I absolutely love the analogy of the traffic jam. I guess I think picking on what pretty much everyone, each one of us, or each one of you just referenced to, most people in the audience would agree that transparency is the way forward. But it's unquestionable that today only few organizations have credibly started the journey towards transparency and sustainability, which means, right or wrong, there are still lots of accusations in the industry of greenwashing. So from your perspective, what concrete steps can businesses take to improve traceability? And the other side of the coin, what barriers exist to transparency adoption? Maybe we can start with Jenny this time.
I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I do wonder sometimes whether having a lack of transparency and traceability is an advantage as well. So, for example, everybody's very well adversed about the dirty factories and what has been going on. And there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes. So, for example, there's been an adjudicator announced by Bays, you know, whereby manufacturers that may have been shortchanged, having orders cancelled at the last minute, having stock being held for weeks, will be able to complain in the future. I do agree that the voice of the consumer now is much stronger, but it's a big area to tackle. You know, it's a bit like, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. So I think that there are very strong enforcements that's now available. For example, the GLAA, the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority. There's the PPP coming through, the Private Public Protocol, which Fashion Entry is part of. And there is definitely a movement towards seeing the end of the issues Mark talked about before with the Modern Slavery Act. But let us remember as well, this is multifaceted. So, for example, you know, in the days of before Brexit, it was very common practice that we would have people, machinists, knocking on our door, and they would ask for 16 hours on and 16 hours off. That was 16 hours on the books and 16 hours off the books. You know, they wanted to be paid cash. Now, and because we are so squeaky clean, it's unbelievable. We of course said no, and we check RTW, right to work documentation. No, so it's not just the manufacturer, it's not just the retailer or the e-tailer putting pressure on price. It is a very complicated industry that we work in, but certainly moves are being made now where there's better buying practices. So factories are not being coerced into accepting prices that are too low because actually they just don't have enough orders. And it happens to us as well. There are cyclical demands in manufacturing. Yesterday we had no work because the fabric was late, and also garments weren't sealed on time. So you can see the pressures that do occur, and sometimes it's very easy to hide behind that lack of traceability.
Very, very good point, Jenny. And picking up on that, who would like to maybe Elliot, what is your point of view on this particular topic? What from your active engagement in UKFT, what do you see the barriers or to wider transparency being, and what can be done for it?
I think there's lots of steps that businesses can take, whether they're a brand or whether they're a manufacturer, at whatever level they enter into that whole supply chain and operate their business from. From a brand's perspective, you can do lots in terms of your social media. You can be, part of the unveiling of wanting to show your manufacturing base. It's very common now for a business to have a social media page and to talk quite actively about where their goods are manufactured, how it's manufactured, and sometimes even introducing the people that make the products. And I think that goes a long way to helping helping the consumer to understand more about where their products are produced and how they're produced and who's produced them. And I think for manufacturers, I can see a question that's appeared in the chat about manufacturers becoming more mindful of transparency. I definitely think that that's the case. I've noticed brands use manufacturers in a way where sometimes they've even had labels where they've actively asked the seamstresses to please write their name, made by whoever, as a part of engagement with that. And like I was saying earlier about the supply and demand element, I think if there's a demand for things like that, the supply can help that. And the more that becomes part of the common understood method of practice, I think that helps to put pressure on bigger retailers to engage in that type of correspondence and take on board that type of information and deliver on their part to this.
Absolutely. It's never only one stakeholder at a time. We need to consider the whole stakeholders range. I guess from your perspective, Mark, from your experience in Marks and Spencer, but also from what you are seeing now, you're working within University of Leeds and what your students are asking you, what do you see as the next logical next steps in order to encourage transparency, but also what do you think the biggest barriers that are currently there are?
Well, I think most responsible brands and most brands who are wanting to be successful, business and from a sustainability point of view, don't need convincing that traceability is really important. If they haven't got that now, then they are never going to get it. It is critical. In terms of how we do traceability, that's the really big question now at the moment, is trying to work out the building blocks of how we move to a more traceable model to get the benefits that we've talked about. To get there, one of the most important building blocks is to say, right, what are my minimum requirements around traceability? What do I have to do from a legal perspective or from a perspective of making sure that my customers are happy? So there's some very critical questions that need to be asked, associated, as I say, with things like the Modern Slavery Act, but also with things like the European timber regulations. That implies that we need to know where the timber's coming from. So there's the legal requirements. That's the starting point. The next really important question for any brand is to really understand why they want a traceable supply chain. Because traceability is a term, is a phrase that's bandied around, but traceable what? What data points are we actually trying to find out? What questions do we want to know? Is it about who made the garment? Is it and you know what gender they are, what age they are, what pay they have? Is it about the carbon footprint associated with the dyeing process? Is it about the social standards and the agricultural challenges that go on in the cotton production areas in agriculture? There's a multitude of questions that we need to be thinking about. So a brand needs to understand what questions they need to ask. And of course, the more questions you're asking, the more complex that process is of getting the data in and also processing the data, particularly for those brands who may have 50, 60, 70,000 lines a year. Traceability is at a SKU level. And in fact, the project I did on traceability wasn't at SKU level, it was at purchase order level, so vast amounts of data. And I guess the other thing to bear in mind is the data that we're talking about here is not the brand's data. This is data that is associated with a product and is associated with the suppliers. So we have to work with suppliers to extract that data and understand the implications of extracting someone else's data and then you using that within the brand context. So there's some really big challenges there that need to be addressed. And ultimately, I know that lots of people talk about tools like blockchain and others in terms of making them work. And for many of these tools, they haven't worked in terms of delivering a traceability system because the focus has been on the tool. What button do I press? And actually, I think from my experience and from talking to other people who've engaged in traceability, the traceability tool does not mean that you stop talking to people. In fact, it's more important to be talking to people and get them to understand why traceability and extracting their data is going to be good for them and good for the brand. So that there are some really big challenges there in terms of the how we do this. And reliance just on focusing on, is it blockchain or some other tool, I think is actually missing a really important starting point in terms of why am I asking the questions, what are the questions I need to ask, and who can provide the data for me.
Mark, I do agree in part, but I also think we also are trying to make this incredibly difficult. I mean, we have QR readers, we have barcodes. I mean, if we, as a tiny manufacturer in the grand scheme of multi-billion-pound companies that we're talking about, now, why can't there be a barcode on a garment, whether or not that is actually put onto the garment or whether or not it's put onto a swing tick, which is later removed? If we know ourselves that we know who the overlocker was, the lock stitcher was, who pressed the garment, why can't that then have traceability back to source, like where the cotton was grown, and is it BCI cotton or is it organic? Is it all fully approved, and what dyes were used? And actually, I do think that there is an onus of responsibility on the big guns of retail and e-tail here, right? Because that consumer voice now for ethical and traceable garments that are kinder to the planet is far more important. We've probably had the biggest increase in inquiries for made in the UK in the since COVID than ever before. With the Brexit implications that we've got, with the horrendous charges of freight from China now, there's never been a stronger case for making in the UK. Never. And actually, the technology, I believe, does exist, but it's the pulling of it together and the commitment to make it happen that is the issue.
You're absolutely right, Jenny, that the data is out there. So I remember visiting spinning mills and fabric mills and garment making factories, and within those organisations, they had their own system for tracing raw materials through the process. And it was really intriguing that all of that traceable data, all of that data associated with each of those factories disappeared as they shipped the material from one factory to the other. And in particular, when the finished product was shipped from the garment maker to the brand's warehouse, whether they're big or small, by the way, that data disappeared. So there are ways, there are some really interesting opportunities to link these things up, but it's a bit like, and I'm sorry, I'm not an IT expert, but it's a little bit like taking, your Apple device and trying to connect it to a Windows device and trying to connect it to, another operating system, trying to join all those things up. And in many ways, this is about IT and making those connections, and they can be done. And I've been involved in projects where it does work. The challenge actually, though, is that traceable data that we're talking about. Is it the right data that we need to be able to make the decisions that we want? So, for example, lots of data about where stuff comes from, but very little data around the carbon footprint associated with the materials. So when we start asking people about carbon footprint, we then get into two difficult questions. The first is, how do we measure the carbon footprint? Because there are many, many different ways of measuring carbon. So that's one thing that has to be agreed across the whole of the supply chain. The second thing is, if I ask you what the carbon footprint of your product is, how do I know what you've told me is
accurate?
Is accurate and is real? So how do we validate the data? So we start getting into those sort of challenges. But I think you're right, Jenny, in many ways that people get hung up on saying, "Oh, this is really, really difficult. We can't do it." But it is about having that deeper dive into your supply chain to get that transparency of what's already there to be able to improve the traceability in the long run. Although I would argue that there's often this challenge about the big brands doing more. And having worked on the big brand side, doing traceability of 75,000 different product lines with a huge number of purchase orders is incredibly complex and very, very difficult to do. Whereas a small brand, where let's say you've got 20 SKUs or 30 SKUs, is much easier in some ways. My personal view overall is actually it is difficult for any brand, big or small. The reasons it's difficult are going to be different, but it's still a big challenge for everyone involved. And I think, by people working together, we can try and resolve that in some ways. But it is coming back to really many brands just don't know their suppliers well enough to even start this conversation.
Well, I would agree about the trust issue with suppliers, because there's been many documentaries about how suppliers then subcontract out to other manufacturers. I mean, in places like Turkey, you've got factories that just do buttonholing. They'll just do overlocking, so they're subcontracting out and sort of saving pennies on a garment, and that's how you get the issues of then coerced labour. But it does go back to systems and processes, and these big guys, that they do have the resources and ethical teams, as well as the purchasing teams as well, sourcing, etc. I actually think it's not that far away where you can actually see full transparency from literally where was that yarn grown, fibre grown, all the way through to the distribution. It actually goes back to the national distribution centres too. Yeah,
you're right. But here's a question that I got asked many times when we were working on this project. Now that I know that my cotton has come from Maharashtra in India, do I know if that is good cotton or bad cotton? Has it been ethically grown? Has it been grown in terms of good sustainable standards? And the answer to that was, all I know with any certainty is it came from Maharashtra in India. And actually in Maharashtra, what we got is there's a real mix of rain-fed cotton and irrigated cotton. So there are some big challenges in terms of what we want that traceability system to do with this global system.
But that's compliance, Mark, isn't it? Because if those suppliers have actually got the data to back that up. So, for example, with the fast forward audit, we must have 5 folders of policies, but we've actually then got the evidence to support it. Now, so that's about trust. It's about doing the audits and making sure that if a retailer wanted to say, right, I'm going to follow that garment all the way back to source and show me the paperwork that substantiates that this is approved organic cotton, and it does exist, but I don't see where the touch points are that it is actually followed through. And you were right, Mark, because you said there are so many SKUs, how can they possibly do it? But if you've got trust in your supply base, and that's why more retailers now are vertically integrating backwards into their supply base to stop this this sort of coercion of labour and incorrect use of data is occurring. We could talk all day on this, couldn't we?
Thank you very much, Jenny. Absolutely, we could. This panel should probably go on for 2 hours, but we don't have that time. But we certainly can have a follow-up. I think we all agree that I think we all have complementary positions because yes, absolutely, tools on their own cannot solve the issues. I speak, I belong to, if you like, the technology side. I work in IBM, and we speak with clients on a regular basis, and they keep on telling us, yes, we want to find a technological solution, but we also need to be mindful that it's also a process issue, and that goes to your point, Jenny, of the compliance. We have organizations that now are fronting this topic, and some I was speaking with some a couple of weeks ago, and they're saying that they are actually putting sustainability and transparency KPIs at a management level, which is great. But the point that you made earlier, Jenny, on the responsibility of the retailers is great. I can use it for my next question, because I think if I look at the calendar today, 15th of April 2021, today we are less than 10 years away from the 2030 UN SDGs deadline. So with that in mind, everything that we know that is feasible versus not feasible, how urgent is action now? What should organization prioritize? And if I can ask, maybe if I can ask that question to Elliot, and if I can ask the panel to spend no more than a minute on that particular topic, because we've got lots of questions from the audience, please.
Sure.
Elliot, could you start?
I'll pick this one up. I think it's incredibly urgent, and in actual fact, it was very urgent about 30 years ago as well. I think it's just been a long exposure of Orwellian opaqueness that has stopped any transparency from really coming to the fore. I think that there's, humans like to use data to be able to explain things that they can't rationalize. And I think that sometimes a holistic approach needs to be taken, a common sense, an understanding of a different set of metrics to understand these types of issues. And of course it's urgent. No big retailer wants to see their clothes made in poor conditions. Of course they don't. But like Mark said, it's sometimes so difficult to control that. So it's been allowed to fester for so long that it's grown and grown into such an issue. And now we need to unpick that. Absolutely. Very, very good point, Elliot. And Max, from what you are seeing, what is your take on the urgency of this matter?
Well, obviously, as someone that's really interested in sustainability, I echo what Elliot said. 30 years ago, this was urgent. We're beyond urgent in terms of the climate challenge we've got, and all the other challenges as well that are out there. But perversely, I'm not going to talk about sustainability in the agenda there and how urgent that is. I would argue that for a brand to be successful in terms of its business criteria, in terms of profitability, in terms of growth, and in terms of delivering what their consumer needs, traceability is an absolutely vital tool. Yes, it will also deliver in terms of sustainability if you take the right actions based on what you find out about that supply chain, but it will actually make your business more sustainable in a business context as well. And what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the state of the UK industry in particular is that real big challenges around Brexit, around COVID, and the way that customers are changing the way that they shop. So although the connections between traceability and those business aspects for many people seems a little bit disconnected, they are absolutely there. For anyone that really wants to make their business last, generations on from where we are now, traceability is urgent. And of course, yes, it is urgent in terms of that sustainability requirement as well.
Very, very good point, Mike. Absolutely. Sustainability is not only limiting the impact on the environment and limiting the impact on social, but it's actually the long-term sustainability financially, because I think we all believe that in a few years, there's not going to be any possibility to survive if you don't have the trust of your consumers and of your supply chain network. Jenny, do you want to add anything on this topic, or shall I move to some of the questions that are coming from the audience?
Well, I would just say, I think it's very simple. If you want traceability, make in the UK, you can catch a train, you can catch a bus, you can come and look into the factory, you can do spot checks straight away. You can visit anytime. Any factory that says, oh no, you had to book an appointment to come in, I would say is dodgy. But if our view is, come and see us anytime, because we don't subcontract, you can come and look at all of our records here. And then from a sustainable perspective, if we get all of our fabrics from Leicester, so think about the carbon footprint, how low that is. We'll have a decision to make a garment, and then you can, within 3 weeks, the garment is made. So that Mark saying about the advantages of sustainability, they're on our doorstep. They really are.
Fantastic way to close this particular question. We've got a few minutes left. For those who, we've got more questions than time, but no despair there. We will go back. We will collect all the questions and come back to you if we've got your details. There is one question. I'll pick some of the questions till I run out of time. But there is a question from Charlie Ross that points out the challenges around collecting data in an environment and in a context where there is a fundamental lack of standard, which means you may end up collecting lots of data from different organizations and duplicating lots of it. I guess the question here is, what are we at risk of working with competing systems, but also do we see a credible standardization across the industry in terms of data collection and data usage?
I think it's a really good question from Charles. What we're talking about here is, imagine you're a fabric mill, and you're based in Taiwan or in India or some other part of the world, or even in Leicester. And you as a fabric mill, you're potentially going to have 10, 15, 20 different brands and retailers of different sizes, all wanting to have traceability. And if they're all asking different questions of you about different aspects of that fabric, where's the cotton come from, or what's the carbon footprint, or what chemicals are you using, as a fabric mill, you'll spend more time collecting the data than actually making the fabric. And I know that sounds a bit like a bizarre thing to say, but when I was involved in a traceability project some years ago, the mill had to employ an extra person to collect the data, to provide all of the information that we needed. And we were one brand asking 3 questions. So I think this is again about how do we recognize the fact that the data is coming from suppliers? How do we work with those suppliers to make sure that they understand the value of gathering that data for the client, but also about thinking about what we do in terms of collaboration. So we have good examples within the industry. We have ETI, we have SAC, we have lots of different organisations that work together to create sort of voluntary standards. And I think to take on board what Charles is asking here is important, because we don't want to be in a position where the suppliers say, you know what, I just haven't got the time, energy, or resource to be able to do this, collect this data for you. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't matter what system you're using, you've got a blockage in terms of people, in terms of gathering that data. So it's a really, and I don't quite know what the answer is, but it's a really important question that brands need to assess when they're going through that journey of becoming more transparent about what they're doing.
Excellent, Mike. Thank you very much for your answer. And unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we will have to end the conversation here. But as we said earlier on, we will do everything we can to go back to all the people who have submitted their fantastic questions. There's lots, all very, very relevant. Thank you so much to our guests today, Jenny Holloway, Dr. Mark Sumner, and Elliot Barlow. And thank you for watching to the audience.
Thank you very much. Good luck, everybody, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.